Eugene Gholz, a graduate of our program, known to many of us just as Euge. So you can address him as Professor Gholz, Eugene, or Euge, depending on your level of familiarity with him. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He works primarily at the intersection of national security and economic policy on subjects including innovation, defense management, and U.S. grand strategy. From 2010 to 2012, he served in the Pentagon as senior advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy. Wow, that's even longer than Vipin's title. But it actually means that he knows a heck of a lot about something that's really important for the future of this country in terms of the defense industrial base. And there are not many folks with his expertise out there. He's a co-author of 2 books, Buying Military Transformation, Technology, Innovation, and the Defense Industry, and U.S. Defense Politics, The Origins of Security Policy. He served as the chair of the International Security Section of the International Studies Association and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously held faculty positions at the University of Texas, Austin, Williams College, University of Kentucky, and George Mason University. So Eugene, welcome and welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, terrific. Very glad to be here. We could have shortened the bio. We didn't need all of that, but whatever. Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. We have this. I know how it works. Yeah, so that bio emphasizes kind of the other part of my life, thinking about the defense industry and innovation. I love that stuff, but I'm not going to talk about that at all today. Today's good old-fashioned military analysis, right? So blowing stuff up. So this project is actually a co-authored paper. There's a real paper with Kirby Davis, who's Kirby is one of our graduate students. This is really Kirby's idea. I want to be clear about this. It's terrific. We used to have a class here we called GPF. That doesn't exist. There are general purpose forces, US military power. But anyway, a campaign analysis kind of class. I was teaching some sort of version of that to Kirby because he thought he should know that. I don't know why, but he thought that was interesting. And so we were talking about a project, like what was he going to work on? And he was interested in the question of blockading Taiwan. And we were thinking about, so the first thing is, there's a decent amount of military analysis of invasions of Taiwan. I've dabbled in this, Eric's dabbled in this, some other people. We have some idea of how that's a challenging mission. And very often in those, there's kind of a throwaway position, which is, well, the invasion might not work, but the Chinese could really hammer Taiwan by just blockading them, right? That would be the easy thing. It's less scary, less kinetic, whatever, something. And there doesn't seem to be that much actual analysis of blockading Taiwan. And we thought, okay, let's work on this. And we were starting to think about how China could blockade Taiwan. And we quickly, as I'll get into in a second, started to think, this has all kinds of problems. This doesn't look so good for China. But then he had this idea that we're looking for something where, from the Chinese perspective, it looks promising. Like, we want to find the most promising thing that the Chinese could do to screw Taiwan. And he had this idea, okay, people sometimes talk about the missile attacks they could do. They could sort of rain fire on Taipei, right? Sort of random strategic bombing by firing missiles at Taiwan, the bolt from the blue of missile strikes as one of the other Chinese options. And that just seems stupid. Is there anything clever? And the answer was, well, maybe they could use missiles to arrange a blockade of Taiwan. It's Kirby's idea. And it's like, wow. It would be nice to find a way where we could precisely think through a scenario for the Chinese to effectively use missiles to do something to Taiwan. And that's sort of the genesis of this. And the answer is, by the way, just to give it away, this is actually something where if the Chinese decided, like, your mileage may vary on whether they think this is a good idea. I'll talk about that at the end. But they can do some real damage. Like, there is something that looks plausible from a Chinese perspective. That's sort of the punchline. Okay, so the problems with the traditional blockade. I'm going to highlight 2. There are probably some others that we could think through, but Traditional blockade, by this we mean either sending surface ships to ring around. So this week the Chinese did this, right? They have this exercise. They actually announced that one of the things they were practicing was blockade against key ports. I don't know exactly what key ports means. There are only 8 in Taiwan, so isn't that all of them? But in any event, they're interested in the blockade, and they were practicing doing it by surface ships. Now, you could also imagine people talk about doing this as a quarantine instead of a blockade. Quarantine, this made-up word, you don't have to declare war. They could try to conduct VBSS, visit board search and seizure of ships trying to approach Taiwan to kind of hassle them in a way that they would argue is a regulatory mission, not a war, something like that. But so you could think about surface ships being involved. That's kind of what we have in mind here. But you could also take it a step further and say, well, this is a blockade like the U-boat blockade of Britain. So they send some submarines. They just randomly sink ships that are approaching Taiwanese ports. And these have some problems. So one is the risk to China's fleet. So China, we read it in the newspaper all the time. Now they have a fleet that's bigger than the American fleet, right? Ships are cheap and easy for China. They don't really care about the risk to their fleet. What's it for if you don't use this military that you keep talking about, right? That's the Madeleine Albright paraphrase. I actually don't think so. Like, their fleet is a prized possession. It took some effort. A bunch of their fleet is not that good. So we're talking about a small section of capable ships. I don't think they would want to risk it, but it's clear that this would bring risk. The blockaders, these surface ships, have to stay on station, probably not within 24 miles of the coast, which is what they practiced this week. But, when they're out there, the Taiwanese, if you declare war, a blockade is an act of war, the Taiwanese are not going to take this just comfortably, right? They're going to fire anti-ship missiles at these ships, and China's fleet could be vulnerable. If you don't want that to happen, the Chinese are going to have to suppress Taiwan's anti-ship missiles, these mobile missiles. So in order to keep surface ships patrolling Taiwan, the Chinese are probably going to have to start putting missiles into Taiwan, flying reconnaissance, doing whatever they can to find the mobile anti-ship missiles, which from Taiwan's perspective, the good news is the Chinese fleet is always there. The Taiwanese trying to harass or sink that fleet can turn on for a minute every once in a while, pop off a few missiles and turn off, and they get to decide when to do that and when not to do it. So this is a pretty undesirable mission from the Chinese perspective. And by the way, if you thought blockade was the non-kinetic, sort of peaceful, easy alternative to the invasion, it's pretty easy to start imagining how this actually is a pretty kinetic mission with lots of bombs going off, right? Okay, the other problem, which I'm interested in, maybe more interested in, is that I think the blockade has a significant horizontal escalation risk. So I've sort of already told you there's vertical escalation. Like, you're really fighting if you do this. But there's also the problem that if you are interdicting and sinking ships that are trying to approach Taiwan, you're sinking things that are not Taiwanese, right? They're owned by foreigners. They're owned by Japanese. They're owned by Americans. They're owned by, they're flagged in Liberia or whatever. But these are assets that mean something to people who you want to isolate this conflict from, right? If you're the Chinese, you don't want to say, I have a conflict with all the countries of the world who are engaged in the shipping industry. You're trying to say, I have a conflict with these rebels in Taiwan, right? And so you have a problem that you're going to harass these ships, and it's actually worse, which is, I think, the escalation choice, so in the shelling sense of thinking about the last clear chance as the country that faces the pressure to escalate or back down, it's actually the Chinese in the surface blockade. So the way you should think about this is sort of jokily, but it's not a joke, right? Mariners talk about the law of gross tonnage. Cargo ships are enormous, right? So the Chinese militia ships, Coast Guard, they harass fishing ships all the time. It's a pain in the neck, whatever. But these are tiny little ships. You can swarm them, you can encircle them, you can box them in, you can ram them, no problem, if you've got a little Coast Guard cutter. If you've got your little speedboat, Coast Guard cutter, PT-109, whatever you have in your mind, and you're going after a container ship that's got 24,000 20-foot containers on it and is 300 meters long and is hundreds of thousands of deadweight tons, and you try to stop that thing by putting your speedboat in front of it, what's going to happen? They're going to say, all ahead flank, your speedboat's going to be there, and then your speedboat's not going to be there. And the people on that container ship are never going to notice, right? You just can't stop this thing. If you want to stop this thing, you've got to shoot it, right? The choice for how to stop the incoming cargo traffic is not with the Taiwanese captain or the container company or whatever it is. The choice is, are the Chinese going to put 5-inch gun rounds in the engine area of that container ship? Or are they going to fire a torpedo into the propeller, right? And that's going to make it very hard for the Chinese to execute this surface blockade. So what else could they do? Well, the alternative is shut down the ports. So even if ships can freely travel to Taiwan, if those ships can't unload and load, you have the same effect on the Taiwanese as if the ships never made it to Taiwan, right? We still don't have food. We still don't have fuel. We still don't have, I don't know, microwaves or whatever it is you're trying to import, cars. So, so let's think about a very bounded target set that you could try to attack, and ideally from their perspective, which we're going to talk about in a minute, you could attack in a standoff fashion, right? You can fire missiles without traveling to Taiwan, without putting your fleet at risk, without putting any one of yours at risk, except for the disposable missiles that you intend to explode, right? So you can stop their consumption if you can shut down the ports. And the ports feel like a bottleneck. So there's a limited number of ports. Generously, Taiwan says they have 8. And the 8 actually matter for intra-Taiwan trade. There's a fair amount of trade in small ships that goes from one Taiwanese port to another to distribute goods around the islands. But in terms of international trade, bringing stuff into Taiwan to keep people alive, like think about food to Britain in the U-boat campaign, right? Well, they've got less than 8 really for that. Each port has a limited number of channels and berths, right? There's a limited number of places that ships can be served, and the ports require this intricate infrastructure. So cranes and storage facilities, right? The ways that you get your stuff on and off these giant modern cargo ships. And the good news is, if you do this, if you attack with missiles, you avoid risking your fleet because you do it all from mainland China, launching the missiles, and you're only hitting land-based Taiwanese assets that are owned and operated by these separatist, terrible people. I mean, right, I don't think they're separatist, terrible people, but if you're putting yourself in the CCP mindset when they're thinking about, hey, how are we going to go get those people in Taiwan? They would say, the good news is we're only hitting the rebels. Okay, so this has actually been done. In most of the major wars in history, one side or the other has decided they would like to shut down ports on the other side, sometimes to prevent naval sorties, but often also to prevent trade, make the other side poor, make the other side starve, break their will, those kinds of things. But the history of port attacks isn't very good. It's not been easy to pull off port attacks. So the attacking weapons, even once you get like large bombing raids in World War II against ports, are not very accurate, right? CEPs in the kilometer range. And so it's pretty hard to hit the targets you want to hit. You don't know what to shoot at. You don't have intelligence on what are the important bottlenecks in the port or what's in the port at a given time. You don't have aim points that you can easily plan ahead. In the old days, like comparing to these historic attacks, we're going to find out they only tell us so much about how we think about the modern Taiwan thing, because there are not very many valuable targets, because how did ports used to operate? Well, they were very labor intensive. I don't know, I'm not even old enough to have seen it in the theaters, but there's a classic movie On the Waterfront, Marlon Brando, famous guy, right? He's a dock worker, right? Like there used to be lots of people whose job was to walk in and out of ships carrying stuff. There was nothing to break. Like you could try to kill the dock workers, but new ones show up because that was not a skill, high human capital job. Like dock workers were brawn, right? And so you couldn't stop the port by breaking anything in particular. And then of course, you could have air defenses or, if you wanted to do this with a soft raid or something, you could put up fences, have guys on the land, make it hard to attack the port. So the best cases of hurting ports historically are ports that somebody owned that they were abandoning, right? So the Germans owned the channel ports in World War II through most of the war. There was this little thing, D-Day, we were taking them back. As the Germans left, they wrecked the ports because they didn't want us to supply ourselves. And so we could learn from what are the things that actually cause damage to ports from that experience. And basically, people try to scuttle ships in the channels and at berths, so you can't bring in new ships because there's debris in the way, right? So you want to jam up the water, and you want to destroy the cargo handling equipment, the cranes, the rails that move things in and out, the marshalling yards, the more of that you can mess up, that can damage the port. So we learned from history what we were trying to do if we were PLA trying to destroy Taiwanese ports. So the modern situation is a little different. The reason we think this is promising is that it was hard to break, especially in a standoff way, historical ports. But the situation has changed such that the Chinese are really in the game. And they're really in the game in a couple of ways. So first, ballistic missiles are now much more precise, right? So we're gonna talk about imprecise ballistic missiles in the model in a minute, but you could get a 5-meter CEP if things are on a good day. The imprecise ones have a 30-meter CEP. That's gonna turn out to be good enough to wreck the ports, right? You can use a pretty bad missile to damage the ports pretty seriously, but that's way more precise than the bombing that was available before. Or in the old days, when you put like a fire ship, you like lit the ship on fire and pushed it towards the port and hoped to run into something, right? That was pretty inaccurate. Now you're much better off. The other thing, port infrastructure, much more capital intensive than it used to be. So if we think about aim points, there's a very limited number of cranes that are they're much more specialized and much bigger than normal construction cranes. So a modern container ship might be 40 meters across, something like that. And so if you bring up a normal construction crane, it might not be able to lift a 50-ton container without tipping over, but even if you got one that could lift that container, it can't reach 40 meters to the other side. It's just not big enough. So if you break these cranes, it's going to be hard for the port to still operate. And it turns out in all of Taiwan, there are 142 of these things currently. And you could buy more, whatever, but they're not easy to just pick up at Walmart. So 142, and then there's bulk handling, right? So the other big thing that matters, so if you're going to bring in, so lots of bulk cargo is like gravel, aggregate, whatever, asphalt, basic things. Petroleum, which is it's a different category, but it's also food. Lots of your grain comes in this way. It's also chemical inputs. It's also coal, which you use to produce electricity a lot in Taiwan. And it turns out they also have specialized handling equipment, grabber cranes and screws in cargo handling. There are about 41 of those in Taiwan's ports. So we have a pretty 183 aim points if we want to break everything. The other good news about the world today is satellites work. We can see stuff. You can see stuff pretty fast. Now, in principle, things move, but they actually, cranes move, but they move pretty slowly, right? So they might move, it might take them several hours to unload one bay of a container ship before they move. And when they move to the next bay, which I don't know, 6 meters over, right? So you're still pretty close to that same aim point. So even if the crane is moved, your missile shot has a decent chance of killing it. So, you know, satellite imagery, if you're getting your shot off within a day of when you have a fresh satellite image, you have a pretty good chance of finding meaningful aim points. As it gets real time, people have suggested even oil tankers. So I thought oil tankers are a bad target initially, because the way oil tankers unload, there are some that unload at fixed ports, right? You pull up to the berth, plug in the pipe, and you unload it from a specific location. But most of them actually operate at floating buoys now. So you have a buoy out there, the container pulls up to it, the end of the pipe that brings the oil onto land can spin around. You can be any aspect, any angle. So if the ship is moving with the tide, with the whatever, now the ship's a moving target and is hard to kill. But I bet it's within the range of real-time satellite intelligence now. So if you wanted, you could probably even hit the tankers. So we've solved a bunch of the problems that made old attacks on ports not work very well. So you might think the Chinese are in the game. Now, we're just going to rule out for the rest of this analysis targets on petroleum infrastructure and liquefied natural gas. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to go after the tankers. They're foreign owned, they're in the water, they're harder targets, whatever. But you could hit all the storage facilities that are on land, all the big above ground tanks holding the crude oil or holding the LNG, or the gasification or regasification plants. The problem is in Taiwan, these are really bloodthirsty targets. Like the Chinese could decide to do this. But if you go to Kaohsiung, for example, the biggest port in Taiwan where they bring in a bunch of this stuff, not all of it, a lot of it comes in at Mailao, but whatever, if you go to Kaohsiung, the docks where they bring in the crude are next to a residential area. And if you caused a big fireball there, you would also blow up a whole bunch of apartments, a bunch of restaurants. You know, it's sort of weird, but the industrial stuff and the city are right next to each other. And so you would have to commit as Chinese to a lot of collateral damage. And you might, right, again, your mileage may vary on what you think the CCP how they would make their trade-offs in launching this attack. But we're going to try for a more modest, less collateral damage, less escalation risk way of approaching the attack. Yeah, we could talk more about that if you want. But now, the other thing to note about the modern situation is that these container ports are no longer all about imports and exports for Taiwan. About half of the trade that comes into Taiwan, container trade, not so much for the bulk trade, but about half of the container trade comes in on a long distance shipping line, goes out into the yard, and gets reloaded on other ships, and not just distributed in Taiwan, but gets distributed elsewhere. It's a hub and spoke trade network. And actually, Kaohsiung was an early model of doing this. Taiwan is doing this less. Kaohsiung's now become the 19th, I think, biggest port in the world. It used to be top 5 because a bunch of this hub and spoke trade is moving elsewhere. But something like half of the peacetime tonnage coming in and out of Taiwan is not destined for Taiwan. So like if you reduced throughput in Taiwan's ports by 50%, there would still be enough throughput to keep everyone in Taiwan enjoying their current level of consumption, right? You'd just be getting rid of Taiwan's wealth generating possibility through their shipping hubness. So that tells you something that helps you scope how much damage you have to do to Taiwan's ports to make your blockade effective. First, you got to get past all the hub and spoke traffic, and then you've got to cut into the stuff that keeps Taiwan alive. Okay. Now, these particular targets, you know, I said cranes are sophisticated. That sounds like fragile, but actually cranes are lousy targets. Cranes are strong structures. They're basically made out of steel girders. You could sort of loosely think of them as a column support with a cantilever beam, right? They're 2 steel beams, but it's actually multiple steel beams and a lot of air. And the problem is, so if you directly hit it you might be able to collapse the beams. You might be able to do significant damage by actually hitting a crane. But if you have a near miss and you're just creating a shock wave, most of the shock wave energy will just go straight through. It'll pass through the open parts, and the crane itself won't absorb much energy. The crane wants to move out of the way or let the shock wave wants to pass. I'm anthropomorphizing. But if you think of it that way, it's hard to get these to absorb the blast energy and break, like as in falling down. And, you know, we thought about calibrating this. It's unfortunate. It's actually fortunate, but from our perspective, there are occasionally industrial accidents, explosions happen, sometimes in ports, but we can't find any cranes that have been close to explosions in ports, right? So we have no actual information about large blasts damaging these. The closest we came up with was the big explosion in Beirut. There is a container port in Beirut, but it's far enough away from the container port that maybe the explosion generated something like 1 psi of overpressure at the container cranes. That's sort of a trivial shock wave. It might have broken some glass, right? But it's not going to damage the cranes. So we don't have anything to directly model this on. And we know, however, the US Air Force has tried with more accurate and bigger bombs than these missiles, 2-meter CEP, 2,000-pound bombs, to knock over radio towers, right? Say in the Balkans. And it turns out they can't, right? They're not very effective at actually knocking over the radio towers, which strikes me as similar because it's made out of girders with air. Okay, so, but you could still damage these things. You could cause different kinds of damage. You know, misalign the trolley on the crane so it doesn't operate. That's easily repairable, all the way up to deforming some girders that you're going to need to brace the crane to keep it up. It won't operate for a long time. You've got to replace some steel. And if the cranes survive and continue operating, as you think about modeling this, as you think about it from the Chinese perspective, as you think about, by the way, repairing this damage, right? So light damage that gets repaired, the port continues to operate. Well, the Chinese can just take another shot. So you need some rule for repairs as you think this through, how the Chinese or how the Taiwanese repair damage, get the ports operating. Because remember, they want to eat. So they're eager to have the ports continue operating. And the Chinese don't want them to eat, so they're going to fire another volley of missiles every once in a while. Every time they start to repair something, let's blow it up again. There's the other category of targets. Again, we don't have a lot of data about actual attacks, people putting missiles in large container ships or large bulk ships. There's a little bit of data now, more coming from the Red Sea. But basically, the Houthis can't hit the broadside of a barn, and nothing ever gets sunk in the Red Sea. So, you know, the data is the ships are resilient targets. But, you know, from the perspective of the Chinese, bulk ships are big open containers. If you get something to explode in a bulk ship, there's not much internal structure, and so you can probably break the keel. Container ships are like that, but all these containers on top of it, you could think of them like reactive armor. They can absorb a lot of energy without damaging the ship. The containers can move out of the way. You could blow them off the top of the ship. So if you hit a ship while it happens to have a lot of containers still in it, that ship is unlikely to sink. If you happen to catch the ship when it's nearly empty, you might be able to get the energy to go into the ship and break the keel, right? But so ships are better targets than cranes, but they're finicky. Okay. What does China have? They've got a lot of missiles. I don't know a lot how you think about that. They have a few types. We're going to show model. We're going to show something related to our model with the DF-11As. These are old missiles. They might be being phased out and replaced with better missiles by the still short-range missiles, still relatively small warhead, but 500 kilograms is a pretty big explosion. These might be the easiest missiles for the Chinese to imagine firing because they've got a bunch of them and they don't have lots of other uses planned for these missiles, right? These are missiles that are maybe phasing out of their rocket force anyway. So why not make them available for this mission? These other missiles that are bigger, longer range, and potentially more accurate have lots of other missions. Every time you use one of those missiles and fire it into a port, that's a missile that they can't hold in reserve for if the US intervenes, we want to fight, or hold in reserve for attacking a Taiwanese military installation, or something else. So it seems much less costly from a Chinese perspective to use these missiles than these missiles. But again, I don't know how the Chinese calculate this. I don't know how they're thinking. I wouldn't pretend to know. Maybe Taylor knows. But in any event, that's kind of what we're talking about. We've got pretty big bombs and pretty good accuracy. So we built a model, and it was fun. It's interesting, I think. Hopefully I'll interest you. It kind of works. We're going to run into some problems as we get to this. We're still fixing, which is annoying. But the idea is we're going to simulate missile strikes on the ports, fire a missile that has a certain accuracy. It's measured in CEP, right? Circular error probable, the radius of a circle where 50% of missiles fired would land. So we don't know where they're actually going to hit. So we simulate that by random draws. We also estimate the damage. I talked through some of the damage conditions, but that's variable because you don't know exactly where the missile explodes relative to the target. And so we don't know, you could, in principle, develop a detailed physical model of the shock wave and try to think about how the energy is absorbed and a pressure impulse graph for the target and blah, 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 blah. We don't do any of that. We just Monte Carlo the damage levels from a reasonable range. Then you simulate the hampered Taiwanese port operations and repair efforts. So you've busted up the port with a Chinese missile strike. The Taiwanese still want to eat, so they keep what's left operating and try to fix things. They lose some time for the cleanup, right? They can't operate all the time. And even operational cranes, there's debris. You've probably killed some of the highly skilled crane operators, or you're operating the cranes not from a cab on top of the crane, but now remotely, because these things have the characteristic that you can operate them digitally from afar. You could operate these cranes from Finland if you want, where some of them are made. But that's less efficient. So you dock their efficiency. And then when they get good enough, the Chinese are willing to fire another round of strikes. So that's the model. And what we want to measure is how much cargo in number of containers and bulk tonnage the Taiwanese get compared to peacetime levels over a 100-day period, right? And you could extend this if you want. You can make it a 3-year model if you wanted, but whatever. We did 100 days. And from China, we're going to track the number of missiles used, and we're going to track collateral damage, how many internationally owned ships they hit accidentally that they didn't mean to hit, that kind of thing. Because these are things they might care about suppressing. And, we run the model a bunch of different ways. So you vary the number of Chinese missiles per strike. The main thing we started with is if they fire one missile at every operational crane. These aren't very good missiles, we thought. 30-meter CEP, they're likely to miss. Cranes, of course, are pretty big, so how likely to miss? That's an interesting question. And then we said they'll fire 2 missiles at each ship when they want to hit ships, if they're not trying to miss the ships. One thing that's possible, by the way, is if international shippers get scared off, which I don't think they will, because they don't historically in these kinds of things, but it's possible that once the Chinese announce the blockade, Maersk will be like, no way we're sending ships anywhere near there. They did that in the Red Sea. Then you'll only have Taiwanese-owned ships serving it. Now, of course, 3 of the largest shipping lines in the world, right, Yangming, Wanhai, and Evergreen, are all Taiwanese. And if the Taiwanese government, which partially owns one of these shippers, can coerce them into continuing to serve Taiwan, now you have rebel ships, and maybe the Chinese are actually willing to target the ships. But so you could change their strategy, is I guess what I'm saying. You could think about different things that Chinese are willing to target and how many missiles they fire at each. Turns out if they use this, Taiwan is just wrecked, but it uses a lot of missiles, maybe 700 missiles over 100 days. That could, mileage may vary on whether you think 700 missiles is a lot, but that's a meaningful fraction of the total Chinese missile stockpile of these types of missiles. So maybe, we also try firing half as many missiles to see what effect that has on throughput, and you can try different strategies, right? Those are fun things to play with. You could vary the type of missile. It turns out the inaccurate ones are easily good enough. So why would you waste better missiles? You change what you're aiming at. This is my favorite. We don't actually have nice results yet to show you. But if they're afraid of hitting ships, and so instead of targeting the center of the cranes, they target the landward side of the cranes, it reduces the chance that an accidental miss will hit a ship. And so the question is, can you make it give up some of your ability to actually hit the cranes you want to hit in exchange for reducing the chance of accidentally hitting ships that are owned by non-Taiwanese people? And is that a good trade-off for the Chinese? And so we think about that strategy. You can vary what the Taiwanese do in response and various other things. Okay, so what do we do? Well, again, Kirby understood that R, which I don't use R, I'm an old guy, I use Stata, right? But R has some nice features where you can work with graphics. So you can ingest satellite photos into R, create polygons, like sort of GIS style, different layers of polygons on top, and see where things are and where they hit. So this is a picture of a piece of the Taipei port. You can see these are some cranes not opposite ships. These are some cranes currently serving ships. This is a large container ship. That's a small container ship. Anyway, you ingest it into R from the satellite pictures of all 8 of the Chinese ports, or not Chinese, Taiwanese ports. Then you assign aim points by whatever your strategy is, and you randomly draw from the Rayleigh distribution, which is what you do to figure out where a missile lands relative to a certain CEP. You figure out where the missiles hit on top of so you build a layer of missile hits on top of your targets. They hit in different ways, direct hits or rings of a certain overpressure. Then you assess damage to cranes. So this is that same corner. It's now a map view instead of a satellite view. But you can see we've got 2 dead cranes and a sunk ship. These are 2 operational cranes. They missed those cranes. Those cranes are still working, but these are now useless cranes because you can't pull up a ship to this berth because there's a sunk ship there until you get a salvage operation to get that ship out of there, which takes more than 100 days. So it's not in the model. And these are terrible because this is a dead crane that can't move. And so these, even though they can move on the rails, can't move past the dead crane to get to this part where you can bring up new operational ships. So these are useless live ships. So now the Taiwanese have a choice. They can prioritize fixing this crane so that all 3 of these could move, or they could bulldoze this crane, right? So if you bulldoze a crane, it gets out of the way, you can get back those dead cranes, those operational cranes. But on the other hand, cranes are scarce, right? If they want these back after the blockade ends, they don't want to have bulldozed it. So that's an interesting kind of strategic choice. And then here you see, here's a new small ship that came in because there were 2 operational cranes there and the port operation continues. And so you get results that look like this. Port throughput over 100 days. So we'd like to run this 1,000 times for every set of parameters. Model was running slowly. We got an account on the supercomputer cluster at Notre Dame. We're doing it that way, working through some bugs. So these are averages across 5 runs for where the Chinese target everything. And you can see container throughput, after the first day, after their first strike, is at, 11% of normal peacetime. And they repair stuff, and then here's a restrike, and things bounce up and down. But you can pretty readily keep throughput suppressed below 20% of peacetime. There's a problem with the bulk cranes. So you should take this with not just a grain, but a rock of salt. But this is showing bulk throughput in the 1.5% of peacetime up to 4% of peacetime range. Again, I think there's a mistake here. I think really it should look more like this, but we had to work on that. But it is in the range where this looks pretty effective from the Chinese perspective. And this is firing, as I said, about 700 missiles. And in this scenario, they're also shooting at ships. And so over the 100 days, they might kill 100 ships as well. I also, by the way, think our vulnerability criteria for ships is too generous in this model. So I don't think they would really kill quite so many ships. So how to evaluate this? How to take lessons? So from an operational perspective, the missile blockade looks pretty promising for China, right? They can avoid some of the horizontal escalation risk. They can avoid risking their fleet, and they can starve Taiwan, right? They can interdict unloading ports substantially. And, you know, this is just a military criteria, and that doesn't make it a good idea, right? And you might wonder, the PLA might not think about it this way, because using up 700 missiles relative to the other things they want to do with those missiles, that's a tough choice that military planners would have to make. But it is really interesting. I mean, basically, the targets are actually pretty nicely clustered. So even when you fire with a 30 CEP missile that misses what you wanted to shoot at, there's a pretty good chance it hits something else you wanted to kill. Or the blast radius is big enough from one missile that landed where you want to kill not just that target, but also the target next to it. So you don't really need every missile to successfully hit. So even the cheap, crappy missiles do a good job from China's perspective. So the military side of things looks good for China. Politically, I think it's pretty unclear. So one thing is, there are no historical cases of a blockade leading to significant territorial concessions. It's hard to find ones that lead to meaningful political concessions of any kind. So the closest I came up with is Block Island in the Revolutionary War in the United States was pretty well cut off by the British blockade from the mainland, and the Block Islanders did become loyalists as a result. They did make a major political concession and agree to the king's rule. You could say Taiwan is like Block Island, right? Islands off the coast, something. You could tell yourself that story. I'm dubious, right? So it's hard to imagine, even if you starve Taiwan a fair amount, that Taiwan's going to say, yes, we want to be like Hong Kong, right? But it could happen. That's a political question that I really am not suited to answer. It's also a little unclear how this scenario ends, right? So China can keep firing. The restrike scenarios, the restrikes are pretty small because Taiwan only has a handful of operating cranes. So, you know, once the first strike happens and you fire off a whole lot of missiles, over 100 days on average in our runs, which I don't think we should quite believe yet, but basically show something like 3 restrikes on average, and each of those restrikes is only a handful more missiles. So in effect, China can keep this up forever. Like, they can probably produce new missiles at a rate such that they won't run out of the ones they need to keep the restrikes going, right? So that looks pretty grim from Taiwan's perspective. Like, the Taiwanese have to hope that this blockade is going to end in some way. On the other hand, you know, China actually has a problem, which is if this Taiwan doesn't cave and the restrikes keep going, the Chinese have no easy way to turn this off without serious embarrassment. It seems like it would be a major political problem for the CCP to start this and then stop without Taiwan conceding, right? And so whatever pressure is being applied to China by whomever, however we might imagine, they could find themselves in a bind that makes this a politically pretty undesirable thing to try, even if militarily it might seem promising. The other thing is, Taiwan could do more to be in the game for surviving this kind of a blockade attempt. So spending some time at the ports, talking to some people, I can't promise I really understand everything that happens in these ports, but their kind of civil defense or homeland security exercises, like some of the people we talked to had also been in charge of ports in the United States. And they remembered the United States runs big military exercises in ports, usually about terrorism stuff instead of about this kind of attack, but whatever, they could practice. They don't do anything like that in China or in Taiwan. They're not preparing. You could also imagine better coordination. So like one of the things I sort of assume is that we're talking about trying to damage the cranes and the ships. There's going to be random debris when you blow stuff up on the quayside, or there might be holes in the quayside, places where you need to patch asphalt or patch rails. Those are pretty easy engineering tasks. You don't need specially skilled crane fixers to do that. So basically, I think Taiwanese military engineering units can probably show up and pour concrete and asphalt pretty quickly and keep the quayside in decent hygiene, even if they are not useful for fixing the important specialized infrastructure. But they don't practice that. They don't think about that. As I understand it, again, this is anecdotal stories, but a Taiwanese guy whose conscript service was as an engineer in an engineering unit, they didn't practice anything, right? They sat in a room, right? And they got to get better. They could do better at preparing for this sort of thing. And of course, what every company that's involved said is, it's not our responsibility to prepare or think about this. The government should pay for a bunch of spare parts. They should pay to have salvage capacity available in the port, these kinds of things. It's not our problem. The government, of course, said it's when you went to the Taiwan International Ports Corporation that actually owns the ports, the port facilities themselves are government owned. They said, oh, we don't do any of this. It's all the terminal operators who handle all the maintenance and repairs. And so they got to sort that out. A bunch of people in Taiwan also mentioned that China won't attack our ports because if they do, we'll attack their ports. Like they have some dream of a deterrence scenario. I think it's fantasy. I think it's nuts. Like the Taiwanese don't have the equivalent missile arsenal to the Chinese that could be launched at Chinese ports. One possibility, they could make the threat real by buying some mobile land attack ballistic missiles. That sounds scary to me, right? That sounds like a spiral between China and Taiwan of offensive punishment systems. I don't want that solution. I don't know what alternative punishment strategy they have, hoping that the world will put sanctions on China if China launches these and that the sanctions will bite and something. I'm not sure. They probably want to think that through. And it's also hard to imagine a meaningful deterrence by denial possibility. Like, is there something that the Taiwanese can do to make the Chinese run out of missiles? And missile defense is one thing you might think about, but then you have the race. Expensive missile defense missiles attrit somewhat the number of incoming missiles against cheap incoming missiles. I think that's a bad offense-defense balance ratio for Taiwan. Like I don't think, it's not obvious what Taiwan can do if their goal is to impose costs in this scenario on China, basically make China run out of missiles or not have enough spare missiles to do their military operation. So I haven't found a great silver lining for Taiwan, but I think Taiwan should try to think about ways to make themselves resilient because I'm looking for China's best strategy. So that's the pitch.
Thanks, Eugene. That was terrific. So
terrifying.
Questions, please hold your hands up. Let's see, Caitlin, I saw you first. You have the first question. Everybody else. Sure.
Great. Well, it's nice to see you, and thank you for this presentation. It's really fantastic and thought-provoking piece of analysis. And I really like that you're pushing people to think beyond invasion scenarios, because I totally agree. I think that like the Pentagon is way too focused on them. I think that's not how this is going to happen. And you know, your points about blockade are well taken too. I had sort of some extension questions. So one is, have you come across any evidence? I know you studiously and repeatedly said, like, I'm not studying Chinese intentions and I'm not a China person, but is there evidence that China is thinking about these types of operations? Secondly, you know, you asked, how does this end? You know, can China back down from this if Taiwan hasn't made concessions? I mean, is it the answer that China escalates further and does other operations? And have you thought about modeling like the oil piece? Because it seems like that would be the next pressure point. I mean, you're right. I think they probably don't do that straight out of the gate for the reasons you mentioned, but you've also given some reasons why maybe they would move to that another branch in the decision tree. And then lastly, on the point about what Taiwan can do in response, isn't Taiwanese resilience about more than port resilience? I mean, isn't it also about having foodstuffs and, you know, other, you know, this gets to the oil question, but having other stockpiles on the island that would enable it to ride out these attacks and actually raise the bar for what these attacks would have to do. And I'll go ahead and ask, is there any evidence Taiwan's doing those things? I know the answer is no, but go ahead.
Do you know the answers? Any more questions?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good talk.
So, hi, Caitlin. Good questions, of course. Nice to see you. I don't know if the Chinese think like this, right, at all. I would imagine they're not dumb. I can think of it. Why would they not think of it? Really, Kirby could think of it, so why couldn't they think of it? I mean, Kirby, it takes a lot to be Kirby, but they got a lot of people. I'm sure they're thinking about something other than what they did this week. Because what they did this week militarily is ridiculous, right? And so they must have something in mind, which is the real thing, because they do talk about blockade. But that's all I know. Could they escalate if first strikes don't work? Yes, of course. Could they escalate to oil? Yes. Other people have favorite target sets. Power plants, hard to fix, very fixed locations. They have some nice characteristics as targets. They also have some bad characteristics as targets. Sure, they could try all of those things. My philosophical instinct is not to prejudge. Like, that's them in the moment figuring out. They would have escalation options they would consider, but like, this is the lesson of the strategic bombing survey or whatever else, is that when you're on land and you have smart people doing stuff to adjust and adapt, it's very hard to predict where the pinch points are or who's going to do what. Like, this idea of finding magic targets is nuts, right? And so if I thought through all of the possible targets the Chinese could try, I would just be playing whack-a-mole with made-up targets. Like, yes, they could do something, but I have no idea what. The ports are discrete because, there's not easy substitution around the ports. You can't do the kinds of adjustment to get out of the ports problem, but you can do the kinds of adjustment once the materials are on land, that kind of thing. So I don't know what they would go for that would cause the kind of escalating damage that they would want to impose on the Taiwanese. And the last thing, should the Taiwanese stockpile products? Of course, and no, they don't. And this seems like a national government issue. And yeah, I mean, the politics of Taiwan, right, I'll have to go to Taiwan and talk to people, but the politics of Taiwan seem to be, one political party says there's nothing we can do, let's make nice with China. The other political party says there's nothing we can do, let's make nice with the United States. There is no political constituency in Taiwan that says there's something we can do, let's do it. Right? It's all about passing bucks, and that's disappointing. You're in charge.
I'm in charge. As Mao said, with you in charge, I'm at ease. So, Nick.
I appreciate the talk. You briefly touched on the idea of China being forced to potentially lose face if they don't get what they want. And I see the missile attack as a very strong escalation from the status quo. Do you see activity which could have the same effect yet not be so escalatory prior to this, whether you briefly mentioned changing insurance rates or the economics of ship activity, or perhaps targeting self-unloaders, things like that? Just, I don't know if you can speak more to that.
Yeah. So my general instinct is no. If you care enough to send the very best, right? In the old Hallmark commercial, like, if you want to pull off a military operation, you got to do it. And so, we're having a moment in U.S. politics where we're freaked out about Chinese manufactured port cranes in U.S. ports. So the Chinese actually manufacture most of the port cranes in Chinese ports. In fact, it turns out that something like half the workers in Taiwanese ports are mainlanders. And so people worry about, saboteurs, inside people, that kind of stuff. People worry about cyber attacks on the cranes. I'm very dubious for various reasons that you could actually pull these off. Like, engineering in the back door and knowing this crane is going to be the one that I want the back door in, not the crane that's going to Denmark or whatever. Like, all of that is complicated from the attack planning perspective, but there are things like that that people think the Chinese might try. You know, geez, you could just operate these things in manual mode if you want. Like, it's fine. Like, the idea that that would, okay, so you could attrit the efficiency of the port by 10% by making them operate manual. Is that going to be enough from the Chinese perspective? Not a chance. So they wouldn't try it if that was their best case outcome, in my view. But again, people can dream up lots of ideas. This seems very kinetic, but remember, we're already in the world of a blockade, which is a formal war, kinetic operation. So like, you know, this is much better or much less kinetic than the alternatives of attack submarines torpedoing ships. And so once you frame it that way, I think is the right move if you're the Chinese, not some, you know, economic sanction requirement, announcing a regulatory requirement that all ships serving Taiwan have to check in first at the customs office in Hong Kong or whatever. Like, there are these things people talk about that just seem ridiculous to me.
I had a question, but I'll hold it. Let's see, Christine.
Great talk. Thank you. Very interesting. You mentioned that the one incentive for the PRC to do this is to reduce escalation risk, and this seems like a middle ground, I guess. But you also mentioned bombing the containers in port upset all the other countries' trade and the throughput trade, which is also very important for the other country. Doesn't that seem escalatory in that scenario? And then the second is more on the political motivation. I think, please help me understand, why would China want to blockade all of these trade, which includes important Chinese interests as well? You mentioned that Chinese dock workers are working in these Taiwanese ports. Wouldn't that be dangerous for China to do that?
Good questions. Okay, so the second one first, like, why would China want a blockade, right? I wouldn't, but the CCP might allegedly think differently about, you know, serious efforts to, from their perspective, settle the status of the breakaway province. Of course, that's from their, well, they don't say that. They don't use that term. Okay, I'm sorry then. Thank you, Taylor. Okay.
Taiwan is not a renegade province.
Okay, Taiwan is not.
Mainland's point of view.
Well, whatever it is, they might want to do things to actually rule this place that they think they should rule, but they don't in practice, right? And so they might view, you know, they might put up a monument to the patriotic Chinese dock workers who died in the assault of reclaiming the rightful Taiwan rulership, right? Regimes can do this, right? Like, I don't think that that would be the big cost that the Chinese would worry about. But why would they want a blockade? Like, they have to convince themselves that the way forward on Taiwan is to, quote, break the will of the Taiwanese people and make these people who actually, by and large in polls, as I understand it, don't identify as Chinese anymore, suddenly go back to thinking not only are we Chinese, but we are Chinese who want to be ruled by these people in Beijing. And that's a big ask. So they've got to talk themselves into that. That's the political question. Now, the other thing about disruption effects of it's going to affect third country trade, the hub and spoke network, all of that. There are other hub and spoke ports in Asia, right? So like if you turned off all the hub and spoke trade in Kaohsiung, that would just expand hub and spoke trade in Busan, in Japanese ports, in Singapore, in whatever. This is a pretty resilient web. Like, one of the great things about ships is they don't have a fixed destination, right? They reroute pretty easily. So I don't think knocking out Taiwanese ports really disrupts the trade between third parties particularly. Now, if some amount of containers are destroyed or stranded in the initial strike on Taiwanese ports, there's going to be some indemnity to be paid, right? This, like insurance, something will happen. But again, that's small potatoes in this scenario, right? It's, I don't know, I'm just going to make up the number, but let's say it's $1 billion. they're not going to notice. Okay.
All right. Sorry, who is in the back there? All right, I have a two-finger as well, but Maria, go ahead.
So two-finger on this exact.
Is this your one finger as well, or?
Sure. I'll
No, I just want to know.
This exact I don't think the question is so much comparing whether or not the trade can go somewhere else. The question is, in the naval blockade situation, horizontal escalation is triggered by destruction of ships. In your scenario, the ships that are in the ports, given that Taiwan is a throughput port, are very likely to be third-party container ships. So if we're avoiding the naval blockade option because we want to avoid horizontal escalation because we don't want to hit those ships, why are we okay hitting those ships when they're in port as opposed to when they're on the open water?
Correct. So in the launch it all, right, in the scenario where you target everything, including the ships in the port, that's exactly right. So there, the only advantage of doing it in port versus on the water is not risking your fleet, right? So the Chinese still get an advantage by using missiles versus doing it on the water. But I don't think they're likely to choose that option, especially because it turns out that even with crappy missiles, you can suppress throughput, firing many fewer missiles and firing them with a firing strategy, with aim points chosen to make it very unlikely that you will hit the ships. Right, you just want to hit the cranes. And one question is, how many ships do you accidentally hit, and can you pay the indemnity for those? The answer is, I'm sure they can afford it, but if it's a small number of ships, and if you are, from a Chinese political signaling perspective, saying you're going out of your way not to hurt third parties, can you talk yourself into thinking this insulates you? And I'm sure the answer there is yes. Right? You can say, we are very publicly saying our fight is with Taiwan, not with Denmark, right? Or not with France. And, and then you could ask yourself, how much do the Chinese care if they piss off, Maersk and CGA, CGM, right? These European companies, or MSC. But I think they can just avoid that. I think they would try to avoid that. And I think that's a political strategy.
So my two-finger on your response to Christine's question is twofold. One, right, China buys a lot of intermediate goods from Taiwan, especially in the ICT sector. Two, the semiconductor fabs in Taiwan rely on imported gases. Yes. And apparently only have roughly 2 weeks of supply, which means that your strategy could trigger the collapse of
50% of
production
semiconductor supply.
TSMC, which actually is a huge problem for China, as well as
the
rest of the world. But right, so there seemed to be a lot of setting aside the vertical escalation piece, which I think I'd like to come back to later. But like how in this scenario you're painting, right? How do you view these follow-on effects?
Yeah. So. China-Taiwan trade is meaningful. I mean, the Taiwanese actually separate out. They have whole charts in their reports for trade with the mainland as opposed to trade with the rest of the world, as opposed to domestic trade. So it is a meaningful volume, including sometimes for precursor chemicals or things like that. I mean, a lot of it is routine bulk trade or whatever, which you probably don't care about. I mean, yes, the Chinese would have to sort of sacrifice for the duration of the blockade, their exports, just like, when the British blockaded the colonies in the Revolutionary War, they had to sacrifice British trade with the colonies, or the colonies, when they declared independence, sacrificed their trade with Britain, right? Like that's part of the political decision that we think the cost is not so high compared to the political gain we're going to get. Now, the semiconductor stuff, so people usually, when you have a conversation, they're like, oh, but the chips are so important, no one would touch this, silicon shield, blah, blah, blah. So most of the chips travel by air, right? They're not traveling by ship. So this strategy doesn't interdict Chinese chip exports in any meaningful way. Now the Taiwanese chip exports. Now the Taiwanese might for sure want to stop exporting chips to China in this, and that might have an effect on China. Again, that's part of their calculation when they decide to do this, there's going to be a disruption to their current economic relationship with Taiwan until Taiwan either concedes or forever, right? I think those are the options. Now, in terms of precursor chemicals shutting down the factories, I haven't heard this question before. It's an interesting one. I bet some of them come in through bulk trade, not air, but I'm not sure. The specialized, sophisticated stuff are not especially high volume things. The random stuff, caustic soda, whatever, the things that are high volume are totally interchangeable commodity products, so I don't think would pose a problem. But it's a good question to think about. Like, this could be an inhibiting factor for the Chinese.
Yeah, and I'm doing some separate work on this, and don't quote me on, I have to look it up, I'll get back to you, but there's certain gases that only Taiwan can only buy or import from a few sources.
Right.
They would have to take the fab offline, and then it takes 9 months to restart it, right? And so, which would have, very significant.
I don't tend to believe those numbers, the 9 months, but that's a different issue.
Yeah,
but you're right. Would take it offline would be a real disruption. That's an important thing to think through. I'm with you.
Great. All right. I've interposed myself, which I did not mean to do. Okay. So in the interest of time, we have a lot. You did bait me. But there's more.
Yeah.
So, okay. I'm just going to start pairing questions for you so you get as much feedback as possible in the time we have. So, right. And then I don't know the gentleman in the light blue polo, but I'm looking at you. So, right. And then you. And then we'll go back to you.
Okay.
So you referenced kind of in passing at this problem that if a ship is sunk at the dock, it's 100 days salvage.
More.
Or more. And if I recall correctly, in like port sabotage, often what you do as the occupying power that's withdrawing is you sink a lot of ships in the port to make it really hard to use. So I know that there's these reasons you might not want to target the ships politically, and there's challenges to targeting the ships with missiles. But is there some kind of strategy which is a ship-first strategy whose goal is to just clog the water of the ports with as much wreckage as you can, and that could build in a much longer delay?
Mm-hmm. Good, great. I know what to say.
Yeah.
The question is the feasibility of utilizing the islands that Taiwan owns near the mainland from like a forward air defense perhaps, or missile defense.
Gotcha. Okay. So in general, I don't think missile defense is a likely response one way or the other in this, wherever defenses at the port locations or some kind of in mid-course intercept from the, you might want to put radars on the islands, which, you could go look. But I don't think the extra 80 miles or something changes much from the missile defense perspective, like the forward deploying on these islands versus having them on the Taiwan mainland. I just don't think changes anything in your solution for missile defense. So I don't think that's it's an interesting thought in terms of like distributing capability or something potentially you could think through, but from a counterforce attack, but I don't think it changes the missile defense aspect very much. So one thing that we've tried, but I'm not really confident in the results enough yet to make this meaningful, is we tried a targeting ships only scenario because we wanted to have some way of estimating how much of the port throughput reduction is due to sunk ships versus how much is due to hurt cranes. And given especially our current exaggerated vulnerability of ships, it looks like you can clog up the port pretty well by attacking ships. Probably over a couple of strikes, right? Because there's a lot of quayside. So even if you sunk all the ships that are there on the normal first peacetime day of the attack, there's still a lot of free quayside. So you'd have to fill that up, restrike, sink the ships there, fill in the jigsaw puzzle until you've jammed everything up. But you could do it over time, and if you're willing to pay the cost. The other thing to think about regarding this is if you're trying to make the Taiwanese make a deal with you, you want some reassurance that if the Taiwanese give in, they'll be able to eat. And if you jam up all the quayside with things that are hard to salvage, even if the Taiwanese give in, it's going to take a long time for the Chinese to get the debris out of the way and start bringing in more food. However, if you don't do that, if you primarily damage the cranes, the Chinese have a ton of port crane manufacturing capacity. They can stockpile, they can bring in new cranes pretty rapidly, or they can just unload ships the old-fashioned way to get the original food in if they can get the ships to the quayside. So in terms of the reassurance side of this, it's a much better idea for the Chinese to hit cranes than to clog the berths, because they can fix it, right? They want to promise the Taiwanese that if they, give up, it'll be fixed.
Let's see. So next group will be Eric Higginbotham and Kunal.
Cool. Well, we've spoken before on this topic, but since I can't get enough of it, I'll ask a question now. So one has to do with the sector or sectors that you're looking at as far as what you're trying to blockade. So since you mentioned food, I'll go there, and you might have just answered the question. I'm not quite sure, but Taiwan imports a lot of its food, maybe 40%. But that said, like maritime traffic has gone through the roof since World War II. So comparatively speaking, food is actually a tiny percentage, or utilizes a tiny percentage of the shipping that comes into Taiwan. I think it's maybe something like 5%. It's pretty small. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Hard to count.
So it would seem that you'd have to radically shrink the throughput to affect food. And then sort of on top of that question, I'll return to your comment about human ingenuity and the will to survive. So, prior to blockades, there are often predictions about the doom of these countries. It would seem that there are a number of opportunities for fungibility or substitutability. So one is, I'm wondering whether you've looked at geared ships, which I hadn't heard of until fairly recently, but these are ships with the cranes on them, So they come as smaller throughput, slower process, but still an option. And then I guess the other one that you did seem to just mention, but increased slack and the ability to move food, especially in various different ways. And I guess it's not just food, but prior to container ships, you moved food other ways. You moved it in sacks or bulk, so you can move it in a variety of different ways. And I've also learned recently, because this shipping stuff is really a lot of fun, that you can even move natural gas in containers. So anyways, this whole question of fungibility and the ability to sort of use different types of shipping for different purposes.
Sorry, Kunal, yes.
Thank you. It's related to Eric's question about food. So how are you defining the success of the mission? So you keep repeating about the starving factor, that lack of food is an important factor in negotiating. So but
it's just
at what level has the food to go? Because even in the end, you see that in the chart, 15 to 20% of throughput is restored by Taiwan. If I eliminate the 50% of the hub and spoke model, then it's maybe 40% of what Taiwan requires. So I guess food is already covered, and you can always airdrop food, which this kind of strikes cannot do much about. So what is the success criteria for this operation?
I mean, everyone wants to know the answer to both of these questions, right? So, but as near as I can tell, there is no such thing as success in these missions, right? So it's never worked. Yet people keep convincing themselves that it might work this time, right? And so they try it again. But trying to figure out how much do you have to starve people before they give up? Well, the answer is when you starve people, they don't give up, historically. Now, people tell the story, oh, modern people are soft. Oh, Taiwanese people are soft. Oh, Taiwanese people really are Chinese if you scratch the surface. There are a whole bunch of stories where, okay, it'll work this time. But there's no way to calibrate an answer to your question, as far as I can tell. How do you get a political concession out of a blockade? I don't know. It just sounds like you know, a little bit less, like in the pandemic, people were annoyed that sometimes they couldn't buy the thing they wanted at the grocery store. Okay, that's an annoyance. How much does it take to get you from an annoyance to being really pissed off? How much does it take you to get from really pissed off to organizing to overthrow your government? How much, you know, whatever. Like you could draw these lines for thinking about how does this happen, but I don't know how it happens. But that's a you know, political question that somebody would have to tell themselves a story to answer. Sort of a separate question from the military question, what could you pull off? And then someone who's doing the political analysis would have to make a choice and say, oh, that seems worth it to try to me or not, right? Now, you know, there are lots of ways to bring in food, as Eric says, you know, airdrops, flying it in, those kinds of things. To support millions of people, that's going to be tough, right? Like, you're going to have to do better than the Berlin airlift, which was a heavy lift, right? So, you know, you got a problem at a certain point, but I know you've thought about this, so whatever. It's like getting some in is enough. The geared ships, there aren't that many geared ships, right? You got to find the geared ships. So like I talked to some Taiwanese shipping company executives, and we talked about the ships in their fleets, and they're like, yeah, but we lease ships all the time. So it's like, you got any ro-ros? You could bring stuff in on a row, like you just leave it in the truck, drive it on and off the ro-ro. Like you don't have to use a ro-ro as a car carrier. And they're like, yeah, we could totally do that. We could lease those ships. We don't own any ro-ros, but they exist. We could buy them. We could lease them. You know, people might not want to lease them for us because they're afraid we'd get them blown up. Like that's a complicated business decision, but they would try all of those things and they all seem plausible. They're just all things that decrease throughput. And it's not really about starving people specifically. That's just a throwaway, summary way. It's making people uncomfortable in a lot of ways and making them so uncomfortable that they're willing to make political choices. So it's food, it's things that have to do with shelter. It's like, you know, darn it, I'm pissed off, I can't play my favorite video game. Whatever it is that it takes to make people unhappy, we represent that as percentage of tonnage, right? Because I don't know what makes people happy, but I can count and I can think about, and I know that it's somewhere in tonnage. And like, this is a classic criticism of operations research, right? That you know, study things that you can measure, not things that are important. And there's truth to that, but I also know that in this case, the important thing is in there. Which is not the case in a lot of random operations research about, like, I don't know, bomb targeting in the Vietnam War. So that's what I got for you.
Okay, now we're moving into trios. A trio, John Caverly, Raymond Wong, and Dan Siebel.
John, you're going to see this next week.
So Black Sea, there's a lot of operations having to do with blockade and counter-blockade.
Yeah.
Much more importantly, the politics behind it and resulting from it. And a really good paper is there to be written that combines some sort of model about Taiwan with what we're learning from the Black Sea, which is this great petri dish of maritime operations. And the second thing real quick is the SSP DNA is strong in this paper, and it shares the same characteristic that a lot of these papers do, is that you spent 4 times as much time talking about the assumptions that made your model like the perfect model than the model itself, right? So that's all we talk about, right? And it's much more productive, I would say, to frame the assumptions, because you have a lot of assumptions. Like,
of course,
we prefer to starve people rather than blow them up with natural gas. Like that's, you know, that's kind of a thing, right? And that, you know, some assumptions can be adjusted, and showing that your model, instead of saying all these assumptions because I'm so smart are right and they point towards my model as being the best model, it's better to say, my model is robust to a lot of different worlds, right? Where it shows something that is important for all these worlds, rather than say, I need 15 assumptions to be true for this model to be right.
Raymond.
Yeah, my question is very similar to Eric H's. So basically, like, what Do you have a sense of what proportion of the existing throughput can the so-called like low tech or like non-big container ship solutions kind of cover? And like, what's the time lag on that?
Dan?
Yeah, hi, Daniel, very soon. First, I just want to say props to Terry for doing some stuff in ours, for pretty cool good stuff, this outlet and business side. I mean, some of my questions about foods before I could ask, but just in general, like, I kind of want to push more into the plausibility of the scenario, right? Like, you're saying China has this like escalation risk. They don't want to risk their own ships, or escalation, et cetera, et cetera. But then why is this scenario plausible if you know punishment strategies don't work, right? Like, it just seems that there's, why are other alternatives maybe not more attractive? I mean, you can see like in the Gulf, Iranian small vessels actually can harass large U.S. vessels quite easily. So I don't know. Maybe just these things like help the paper a bit more and just find plausibility.
Cool. Yeah, so I love the Black Sea stuff too, John. It's interesting. I'd like to know more about, so like container operations went back at the Odessa port, you know, despite the blockade, which to me is consistent with all the other blockade experience too. Like it's not, it's, you know, container operations, bulk operations, whatever. Exactly how much and in what way. One of my colleagues in graduate school here, Richard Wilcox, as of last year, was doing the UN negotiation. He works for the UN. He was doing the UN negotiations for the Russia-Ukraine shipping agreement, right? Like, I should talk to him more. But my general lesson is from the Black Sea is you can't shut it down, which is, you know, kind of the opposite of the, you know, if you're willing to fire a whole bunch of missiles, which the Russians didn't do, maybe they could, you know, the Chinese could shut down Taiwan, but could the Russians do a similar missile attack on Odessa? I don't know, maybe, but they didn't try that. They tried something else and it largely didn't work. I disagree with you, I think, about assumptions, right? So, you know, you could have a different philosophy of papers. You could try to say, we're going to vary a million different things. We're going to show that no matter if we vary this from, you know, 0 to infinity, it doesn't affect the results, as a way to give more confidence in the paper, to show that, you know, the results are insensitive to lots of different assumptions or lots of different variables. That is a technique that people often use. It is a technique rooted in a view of science that says, you know, assumptions don't have to be realistic. We should build the model for, you know, getting results out the other end. That's not my assumption about how science ought to work. I guess people, fancy words, scientific realism. You try to think of assumptions that are plausible in the real world and see what the result of those assumptions are, as opposed to saying I'm indifferent to the assumptions. It's just a different way of doing work. If you want to do the other, I'm all in favor of it. Have at it. It's just not the way I like to think, or the way I tend to think. You know, the details like what proportion of tonnage could you bring in with other kinds of containers or other non-container ships? You know, there's not a lot of products that you physically can't bring in through these other things. Like you could even substitute, you could use a ro-ro to substitute for a reefer, a refrigerated ship, by putting refrigerated trucks inside your ro-ro. Like there's always a way. It's just a matter of, as you say, nobody knows the cost, the time, the particular efficiency. Like there's no data. You're sort of making it up. You're thinking about, and people are going to try this stuff. And the only way to find out is if they try it. And the only way they're going to try it is if they have to try it. And so, you know, I think the answer is you can bring some. Is it enough? Well, that gets back to the political question. How much is enough? And, you know, is a punishment strategy even plausible, given that we know punishment strategies don't work because we, you know, like Bob Pape? Yes, because as Bob says, people keep trying it anyway. Like, you know, you can write Bob Pape's book a bunch of times. You can write other stuff. You can reinforce the finding. Everyone has a story like, yeah, that's because they messed up this last time, but this time I'm going to get the punishment right and they're really going to succumb. And that's how people tell themselves. It's the military's plan this way. People think this way. Politicians talk about this. They don't even do the analysis. How much does it have to hurt? They just think, oh, there might be some pain, therefore fold. And the truth is, when they actually face the pain, they don't fold. But before they face the pain, when they're imagining, they put a lot of weight in these strategies, right? Like, it's totally reasonable to think a country would try a punishment strategy, like, I don't know, everything in the Levant now, right? Or Ukraine with the random attacks, Ukrainians against Russians or Russians against Ukrainian energy infrastructure or Ukrainian heating infrastructure or whatever. Like, we see people try this crap over and over again. And so we really ought to think about, could you pull it off? Anyway, that's my view anyway. So, thanks.
Great. Well, I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone on the list today.
My fault.
It was obviously very really rich and interesting and fascinating talk. So anyway, thank you so much for coming and for
yeah, thank you for having
provoking
me.
us with this analysis. Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kirby, for getting him and you going on this paper together. So.
Yeah.